In this video, I'm going to show you at least part of the process of how I built a wooden chisel holder. I recently bought a set of Irwin-Marples chisels. 4 chisels came in the set, and the base or the handle of them was heavier than the blade. So unlike most chisels, which you would, I guess, hang downward with the blade pointing down and the handle supporting it on top of a hole or a hook, these needed to be set up upright the other way with the blade pointing up. So I drew this sketch of kind of a hand-drawn sketch of what I hoped would be a little holder for it. And things didn't go quite as planned, but I'm going to kind of walk you through the process of how this plan came to be. I used some plywood that I had around the garage, already cut off for some previous project, and cut out what was going to be the back piece and sanded it as well as I could. It's not perfect. There's still some ridges in the board. It turns out, once I looked back at my plans, that I had actually cut it at a slightly wrong dimension, so I had to change the plan as I went, or go back and buy some more plywood, which I didn't really feel like I wanted to do. So I just adjusted my plan a little bit. And then I used the rest of this scrap here to get the sides and the back and middle pieces of the holder, as we'll see. This is the 2 pieces that I've glued together. This is my first ever glue up, believe it or not. The first time ever using wood glue to connect 2 pieces of wood. And what I did was I cut the 2 pieces about as identically as I could in length and width and so on, and then stuck them together and glued them. And then after the glue dries, I will drill some holes in it where the handles of the chisels will sit. As you can see, I have a variety of clamps here. I actually did this before I bought any F-style clamps, or bar clamps or pipe clamps or anything like that. No parallel clamps, just a couple of squeeze clamps. And then over here, I'm going to start working on a top piece where I hope to put the chisel's blades into notches to kind of keep them from banging into one another. This also turned out to be to not work out as I intended. And the idea is to, when the bottom of the chisel, the handle is resting in the holes that I've drilled in that other piece, the blades will fit into notches here. And I'm using my Incra Tiny T to measure how deep those notches need to be. And here I have cut the notches. I have marked and measured and cut, and I'm going to actually use one of the Irwin-Marples chisels to knock out a few of the remaining pieces. You can see here I've marked off the parts that need to be removed. I'm not really good with the jigsaw. I did use the jigsaw to make the lines in here, but I'm using the chisel to remove the remaining material out of the notch. And this is actually my first time using these Irwin-Marples chisels, so I found out that they are actually pretty sharp. This is probably not what their primary intent is for, but I assume you would use them to remove material from a solid piece of wood rather than plywood, since plywood has multiple layers. But it worked for that. And of course, I'm using the narrow chisel. That piece popped up and hit me in the head. And I think a couple of more did here before I finished. But it worked. And then we'll move on to the next step after I get all these cleaned out. And now you can see that the chisel blade actually fits as I intended into the little notches. I still haven't come to the part where it didn't work out entirely as I intended. Right, back to the part where the handles will rest. I forgot to turn on my camera when I drilled these holes, but there's my son blowing away some of the chips made by the Forstner bits. I did start with small pilot holes and then use the Forstner bit to make the wider holes all the way through this piece of wood that I had glued together out of 2 pieces of plywood. The drill bit did actually move despite having a pilot hole and despite holding it firmly. It did move a little bit, so not all the holes are perfectly lined up. That's a backing board there, so I wouldn't damage my workbench surface. And let me grab one of those chisels and show you here that The handle slides right through. It's a little tight, but I'll sand those out. I didn't actually go through all of them, which is interesting since I drilled all of them with the exact same drill bit. But I will get to sanding so that the chisel handles will all fit through. All the chisels of different sizes have the exact same size handle, so that shouldn't be a problem. Before I get to the sanding, I'm going to use a router bit, again, which I forgot to take a video of, but I'm showing right before I used my roundover bit, which you can see here in my router. I didn't extend it very far. I didn't want these holes to get too close to one another, so I have the router bit very lightly extended past the plate or the foot of the router, and then I'm just going to go around each one of these holes. And as you can see from where the clamps are on the left and the right, I am going to have to move the clamps back and forth in order to get to the end holes. That's just how wide the plate is on the bottom of the router. It'll only get a couple of holes, and then I'll have to move the clamps back and forth. But yeah, as I said, I forgot to put that part on video. But here I have finished rounding over the holes. It does look rougher than it feels. When I rub my finger around the edge of the hole, I don't feel splinters or anything. Well, let me use the hand without the glove. Yeah, it feels nice. I'm not going to get splinters from that, but I still am going to go over it with some sandpaper. There you can see one of the holes that didn't line up perfectly. It shifted, but it should work fine. Plywood's pretty stiff. I think it'll be okay. And here, there is a part you can see where there was a void inside the plywood. I'm going to do my best to fill that with wood filler, or just put it on the bottom where nobody will see it. That's another possibility. But I think it'll be fine. It looks like the chisel handles go through most of the holes, although they are a pretty tight fit. Then we'll start putting all this thing together here. Okay, here are the other boards I have cut, including the bottom, which will sit about like this. The whole thing is lying on its back right now, in case that wasn't clear. And the bottom, hadn't yet decided at this point whether it's going to rest against the back or support the back. I think it's going to rest against the back. That's the top bar that has the notches in it, which I still haven't figured out isn't going to work perfectly. And these slightly trapezoidal, or certainly not perfectly rectangular side pieces. And because I measured incorrectly, they stick out a little too far. Let me stand these up. Don't want to knock everything down. I'm holding the camera in one hand. Yeah, they stick out a little too far, but at this point, I'm not concerned about perfection. I'm just concerned that it's all going to hold together and have a place to set my chisels, since they didn't come with a case of their own. Of course, that bar will set in the middle somewhere. All right, this is a test fit after I just put it together with screws. I decided not to glue this together. Part of it was because things didn't quite fit perfectly. Not everything matched up just right. So I did use wood screws to hold the pieces together. But that's basically how it's going to look after a little finishing. Each of the chisels, including one old chisel that I've thrown in for good measure, I did put a couple of extra holes in there. And this is supposed to sit right about here with the blades turned sideways. But it looks like it's not going to work. And part of the problem is because the chisels lean back against the backing board while they're in their holes. As you can see, they go all the way to the back of the backing board. So if I were to put that top board in there with the notches, it just wouldn't work. There's no room for the notched board to fit behind them. This, of course, was my fault, both in the design and the execution phase of this project. We live and we learn, and again, my idea here was not perfection or a showpiece. This is just to hold my chisels, and I spent far too much time and work on it compared to what it was meant to be for me. But it does hold the chisels, so that part is a success. And here you can see on the sides where I've held it together with some wood screws. I do use the star bit screws, which I find far more easy to use than Phillips head or the cross type head screws. The star bits seem to almost never strip out, which is what I like. And it does look like the chisel holder will stand up with a few bumps. So, almost finished. But before I get finished, as I mentioned earlier, there were a few voids in pieces of the plywood and a couple of nicked off places. missing spots here, so I decided to put some wood filler in it. I didn't actually have any wood filler on hand at this time, so I decided to use a trick that I've seen in other YouTube videos just as a test. Here's some voids on the front, and I think there are, oh, you can see where I've put the notched board in the back as for a little bit of extra stability down there at the bottom. I didn't know what else to do with it. I didn't want to throw it away, so I just attached it in there with one screw on each side. All right, now the trick that I saw on YouTube videos was to use sawdust and wood glue mixed together. So I'm using this old paintbrush holder. It was supposed to keep paint fresh on a paintbrush when you had to take a break or something, but it didn't work at all. The paint just dried almost immediately. So I'm just going to use this as a tray for mixing my sawdust. Now I grabbed my palm sander or my random orbital sander and pulled off this little bag on the end. And it turned out to be almost full of really fine sawdust. So that's what I decided to use, dumping it out into the paintbrush tray. Tried to separate it here because I knew I wasn't going to need all of it. And then poured in some wood glue. Tried to mix it together with the end of this brush, but it didn't mix together very well. That part was frustrating. It always looks really easy on the YouTube videos when the pros just put some sawdust and wood glue together and it just mixes perfectly into a nice tan putty, and then they apply it. But for me, it took a long time. I eventually started using my fingers, but even then, it didn't work out like it does on the videos. It did not. It had more of the consistency of a thick pancake batter than a putty or a Play-Doh like you see in those videos. So I just scraped a bit off of my fingers with this putty knife and then began to apply it to my project. When I applied it, the color looked very close to the actual color of the wood that I had begun with. And it was more difficult to apply than actual wood filler, but it applied and I was able to sand off the excess or scrape off the excess with the putty knife and then intending to sand off the rest later with sandpaper. Fortunately, the part that got on my finger, I was able to just rub my fingers together and that excess part just came right off my hand. I had been a little bit worried about it gluing to my hand, but apparently wood glue only sticks to wood and sawdust, which is made of wood. So I mixed up some more, went about my business, and set it aside to dry. Now, once it dried, you can see the color changed quite a bit. That actually just looks horrible. So I almost wish that I hadn't used this method. But again, this is not a showpiece. It's just to hold chisels. So I'm going to use this plastic sanding block that I've attached sandpaper to and start sanding off the excess where that makeshift wood filler has dried. Because it is made out of wood glue and sawdust, the wood glue is pretty difficult to sand. It took quite a while, quite a bit of work here to get that flat, and I didn't ever get it to look good. And again, the color here just looks almost like concrete in places. Just kind of a really dark brownish gray. Didn't look good at all, but I did get it smooth, and of course most of the voids are covered, which was the whole point. All right, and then after final sanding of the entire piece and applying some clear polyurethane, this is what I ended up with, a not very pretty but sturdy chisel holder. It will stand up on its own. It stands up with the chisels in it. As I move this around, you can kind of see the glistening, the shine of the polyurethane that I applied, which was more just for protecting the wood, giving it more of a smooth to the touch feel rather than for appearance's sake. I didn't care much whether it looked flat or glossy. Again, just to protect the wood, to cover up any small imperfections. There we have it. One of these days I am going to make a slightly better chisel holder. Thank you for watching.